Hello, good afternoon and welcome to this IFG event. I'm Jill Rutter, I'm Programme Director here and I'm one of the co-authors of the Institute's report on how you can support the Prime Minister effectively, called Centre Forward, published in July. If you haven't read it, read it. There is an executive summary if you think it's mind-bendingly long, but there are some good stories in it if you can wade through it all. But we also found, when we were doing the research for that report, that we had a round table with people in government who had worked in or run some of these special units that Prime Ministers like setting up to take forward bits of their agenda. And when we asked them what sort of tips they would give to anyone else done with that, there was so much that we thought was so interesting that we couldn't really fit in the main report, that we thought we'd produce a handy little guide. So if any of you are ever asked to run a special unit, use our 7 tips. Those are our 7 tips, how to make a special unit work. You can find that in our modestly entitled report, The Special Ones. Some people get the reference, some people don't. But those are our 7 tips, But we thought in order to animate those tips and probably add some of their own, we would get some of the people who actually objectively have been in successful units. I realise that not everybody out there necessarily feels that. There is a very interesting story about whether history is won by the victors or those left standing. But we're not doing that today. But what we thought would be really interesting is to hear from people who have had key roles in some of those units. So we have assembled a stellar panel. And I don't say that very often about most IFG panels. No, actually I do. But today, I really, really, really mean it. So, on my immediate left is serial Tsarina, Louise Casey. If there is a problem, she is the Prime Ministerial Ghostbuster of choice, and she has sorted out rough sleepers, respect for Tony Blair, and when David Cameron needed somebody to sort out the 120,000 troubled families, there's some debate about the 120,000, but sort out the troubled families, the person he immediately got on the phone, or at least his representative on Earth, Sir Jeremy Hayward did, was Louise Casey. So Louise is going to share her insights from running all those units, some of which have been located centre, some of which have been based in departments, etc. Then we're going to go to a different model of success, which is the recently spun out, newly social enterprised, very interesting structure, Behavioural Insights team. David Halpern, of course, our former Director of Research at the Institute, is the Chief Executive of the Behavioural Insights team, advising a government wherever you are in the world on how to nudge you into better behaviour that is, they really mean it, is really good for you. And David, I think, in terms of institutional reform, it's probably one of the big, interesting, and certainly massively exported successes of this government. So we're then going to hear from David Halpern. And then we have John Bright, who I've known for a long time in various roles, but John had a very interesting trajectory. He came into government from Prime Concern to work in the social exclusion unit, and then actually did a really sort of difficult thing, which was followed one of the social exclusion unit's landmark reports, its report on neighbourhood renewal, into what was then probably called the Office of the Deputy Prime Minister.
DETR.
Oh, DETR. Anyway, DETR, to work in the neighbourhood renewal unit. So what we're going to do is, they've each got about 10 minutes. They're going to share their thoughts, reflections, extra tips, extra hazards. We'll then throw it open to you. And I know that there's quite a lot of insight in the room. So I'm going to offer you the chance to offer comments, perspectives, as well as direct questions to the panel. And my colleagues in IFG are live tweeting away. But if you want to tweet, it's hashtag special units. And those are the username and the password. So without further ado, and having got our breath back from rushing in from the QE2, Louise Casey, CB.
Thank you very much, Jill. Honour to be here. I rarely talk to civil servants and colleagues about these sorts of experiences, so it was quite an outing when Jill turned up and shone a light in my eye, had pliers out to rip my teeth out to tell her what it's been like for the last 15, 16 years of working in Whitehall, which has been an extraordinary privilege. So I'm not used to talking about being a czarina or running what potentially is seen as special units, whether they're good or bad, and it's for you to judge that as time goes on. So forgive a level of nervousness. I'm much happier talking about homelessness or crime or other nasty problems. So 2 anecdotes to begin with. My arrival from shelter, where I'd been happily or unhappily, you know, you're unhappy and you're happy. Jim Minton worked there, you know what it's like. We're all campaigners and wanting to change the world. And then you get this moment where actually you get a job in government where actually you think you really can change the world. It's an extraordinary feeling. You've lobbied and lobbied and lobbied. You waited for a change of government. That change of government came round. You know, you've been talking to the opposition. It was it was just like, oh my God, this is a dream came true. And they make me, I think it was called the London at that point, homelessness coordinator, which is what the department called it, and obviously number 10 called it the homelessness czar. So that says something to begin with. But what was really interesting about it was that out of a sense of utter and complete protectiveness, on day 2, somebody that worked for me who was a traditional civil servant who'd been put in to mind me, and I needed minding. So that was, if now I was in charge and setting up a central unit employing me, I'd bloody get a reminder, I can assure you. So they wrote this submission that I was supposed to send. I hadn't even heard of a submission at that point to ministers to say, oh, terribly interesting and helpful. I've started the job. Just to let you know, for all these reasons, I won't be meeting the Prime Minister's target. We may get close, but only time will tell. And, it's been nice knowing you, and I'll see you next week. And I kind of looked at this and thought, I was going to say something very rude, but I...
not at IFG.
Not here, and not with the people sat on the front row that are looking at me with menacing looks if I say anything outrageous or rude. And I thought, I know now it was out of a sense of protectiveness, so I had to get them all in and go, look, I have waited for this all my career. We have waited for this moment. Nothing will stop us meeting this target. You don't understand how much this means to me. And, they must have thought, what the hell? So the culture shock between somebody like me coming in with my heart utterly on my sleeve, utterly determined to make sure that no human being should have to sleep on the nation's street, let alone 2/3 of some target somebody had dreamt up somewhere. I was determined that nobody should be out there, to be met by people that were, frankly, rightly risk-averse, thinking this was a rather mental thing that people had decided needed to be done. And what we had to do is to have the 100 good reasons why something couldn't be done laid out, rather than the one good reason why something should. And both those things are kind of right, because it is right that somebody was protecting me in that scenario. They were right that it was an extraordinary thing to attempt and an extraordinary thing to think we could possibly do. And they were also wrong in that actually we needed to do it, and that we had a political imperative, we had a budget. The country was sick of homelessness in every way. They felt sorry for people on the streets, and other people didn't want them out there for other reasons. So the time was right. We were lucky about the timing being right. But it does kind of sum up a culture clash from day one, really. And obviously I've softened enormously over those 15 years, and, oh, come on. Anyway, there we are. Obviously none of you know me very well, because I'm kept hidden. So yes, I have run quite a few. And started with rough sleeping, then went to the Home Office to work for David Blunkett on antisocial behaviour. Another one that was really tricky. People wanted to say lots of kids hanging out on the streets were just kids hanging out on the streets, and other people want to say all those kids should be locked up for life. So, you walk into this political minefield and opinion former minefield, and actually have to strip it all away and just work out what needs to happen on those estates, how it's going to happen, when it's going to happen, and make it happen. And I think that's part of the thing here, is judging the politics of it all whilst you're able to get on and get the job done. We then had the kind of extraordinary moment, because we were seen to deliver on each of these things. So that's note to interestingly. We got to the end of the rough sleeping target, as was. We met it relatively early. We had people with us when we met it. People kind of felt part of it and felt we kind of all had done a very good job, particularly, frankly, the charities and the voluntary sector. And at that point, the Secretary of State, who I think was Stephen Byers at that point, who I'd rarely met, actually, interestingly, and he just turned around to me and went, what next? Like, what do you want to do next? And like, out of a bolt, I went, right, children in bed and breakfast hotels. How much do you need? 30 million, Neil O'Connor said. It was just one of those moments I think, oh my God, this is incredible. Barely met the man. And I went, 30 million. What do we need, Neil? 30 million. And Neil went, change of law. I went, a change of law, Minister. Not calling him Secretary of State because I still hadn't quite got accommodated to letting him go 3 years later. And there we were. And, you know, I didn't have responsibility or indeed the huge privilege of seeing that target through. But actually, because we'd succeeded or perceived to have succeeded in one thing, we were able then to move on to kids. I'm sorry, I'm shorthanding. Basically, at that time, and it's a growing problem, I think, in different ways, we used to basically put homeless families in bed and breakfast hotels, and it was for an unlimited amount of time. And I'd worked in shelter trying to make it at least a limited amount of time. And actually we introduced a law, so that's the great thing about working in government. You can lobby till the cows come home from outside, and actually then these people in government change things. They have money and they change laws, and people's lives change extremely, extremely quickly for the better if you can pull it off. And so somebody else ended up delivering that, but it was a good thing to do. And it's if you're seen to deliver, then people sometimes give you more things to deliver. Went on and did antisocial behaviour. Then Blair came back in 2005. He was stood outside Downing Street and said, I've been around the country. I was about to mimic him, but I'll get in trouble. I've been around the country and I've heard people's sense of disrespect, a lack of respect. I thought, right, I'll have that. And so we knew then we wanted to move into families and prevention of antisocial behaviour and a rebuilding, really, of kind of projects that I'd actually looked at when I was in shelter called family intervention. We then did that, and then, anyway, the rest it goes. And as Jill said, then the coalition, Jeremy Hayward, in fact, and Steve Hilton asked me to do a review of what the Prime Minister was or was not going to get off Whitehall for delivering troubled families. And, you know, hey-ho, somebody independent comes in and says, I don't think you're going to deliver. That was me on that occasion. And then they wound up saying, well, why don't you deliver it then? So that's where we are. Anyway, so I wanted to say a few things. It sometimes sounds glamorous, I think, when people think, oh, God, the Prime Minister has asked me to be a czar or a champion or a commissioner or whatever. And sometimes, because I'm so elderly, somebody else says, would you go and see them, Louise? They're having a little bit of trouble. Will you pop and see them and just talk to them about how they can, you know, work with number 10 and how they can fit? And I remember once walking in and getting to a particular building and realising this person had no carpet on the staircase as I went down. When I got there, I realised there was no printer and there was no computer. And I thought, well, you haven't started well, darling. I don't think you'll be in and out of the Prime Minister's office. The thing is, we can see off outsiders when they come in like tomorrow. They don't even know it's happening to them. They're actually grateful for the basement office with railings on, no private secretary, barely a computer, and no access to anybody at all. They still reel with the joy that they think they've been appointed as a champion by the Prime Minister, popping in and out of, you know, whatever the Oval Office is called in number 10 every 2 seconds. They never see the Prime Minister again. And, you know, the kind of sense really that you have to manage the expectations. And I do think that what Jill and colleagues have done by writing some of this down is just incredibly helpful in terms of trying to make some of this a bit more organised so people do know what they're letting themselves in for when that phone call comes or when they're setting up units. So for me, you can be left with an appointment that looks fabulous, but you've got both hands tied behind your back. You know, press notices go out before you've even organised your team around you. Big mistake. Always have a team. Always make sure you have people trusted in your team. I've had the absolute honour and privilege to have people that have come in and out of my teams for about 15, 16 years. I have a core group of people that actually put up with me for that length of time. They don't stay the whole course. They have to go away for a bit, recover, take time out, do a normal job, have a baby, you know, whatever they need to do. I know having a baby is a bit extreme to leave me for a bit, but people do. And then they come back again, and then we move on. And that's the only way I've survived. I am only as good as the people that work with me. I get all the credit and all the blame, but I'm absolutely clear, if you're going to do one of these difficult jobs, you absolutely have to say to whatever permanent secretary or whichever mandarin is sent to negotiate terms, I need to have my own staff, and quite often you need your own dedicated budget, which these days is significantly more difficult than it has been previously, I can assure you. It is really easy to get bogged down in civil service processes, you know, get round them or get somebody that gets round them. The amount of people I've had to apologise for breaking the rules to afterwards, And, you know, I'm 16 years senior civil servant, a director general, and I still have used it. There's people in the audience that have that, have had that used on them, which I'm so sorry, Sue, I didn't know that's how your personnel rules worked in CLG, or indeed how the budget worked. But anyway, you have to have very broad-shouldered people that work with you in the civil service. I think that the cause is really important for somebody like me. I can't comment on what other people do, but again, the thing that makes it utterly, utterly compelling and driven is that the cause is what matters. So when it's really, really difficult and the days are extremely challenging and you can't get anything done and nobody, you know, you just have one of those days, it's the cause that keeps you going, and frankly, it's the cause that trumps everything. Because when you're in a really difficult meeting with the Treasury or whoever else, you can sit there thinking, the only reason I'm doing this is at some point we're going to get something done for something that I really believe in and care about. And I think that's my personal survival strategy. So all the difficult things that Jill says, I'm waiting for the moment somebody calls me and says, why don't you be the wine czar? Or, you know, I shouldn't go there. Why don't you be the fiction czar? I'm just checking what I can say.
Badger czar?
Getting a no. I don't want to do badgers. I'm not good on animals. Don't know much about them. So I stick to human beings. Anyway, I speak, unlike some civil servants, I have the privilege of being able to represent my own cause, as it were. That takes very broad-shouldered civil servants and ministers. You also need to have people that work with you that understand communications in a different way, because you're a different animal to either. You're not a mainstream civil servant and you're not a minister. You sit somewhere odd outside all of that, where you have the enormous ability to communicate your own message and what you're doing, which I can tell you is fantastic. The upside of that is huge. The downside is you have to take personal responsibility and accountability for that in a way which nobody else has to do. So when it goes wrong, it's not a minister standing defending failure. It's me but in front of the PAC in a very different way. And again, I don't mind that because you can't always get things right. But there's a kind of side to that which I think means you have to get organised a different way. I would say I've watched some people come and go from Whitehall, I believe turn into what I call talking heads, and I think that's a real mistake. I was genuine in what I said at the beginning. It is rare for me. Had to be persuaded by Jill to even do this event or even be involved in their thing, because I think what's got me through is, nobody's asked me to go on Have I Got News For You. Obviously, I fight to go on it, just sit next to Paul Merton, but, that isn't going to happen. Or be on Gardener's World, or indeed, pick out terrible records on Desert Island Discs. And even if they were to, and we've regularly turned down things like Any Questions, we're always looking for women, and Question Time, we say no. And I think it's a really dangerous point when people in my position think that they can have views on anything. We can't, we shouldn't. We should only have views on what we're paid to have views on, and that's our policy area. And even those, we ought to be careful about how we do them. So I'm relentlessly asked for my views on children's services more broadly at the moment, and I have to be quite careful on what I say. Ministers are elected, ministers are in charge of policy. I run a discrete piece of work that I'm publicly accountable for, but I have to be careful. And I have seen people have their heads turned by that, and I think that's a very dangerous place for colleagues to be. The media is a really seductive place, and I just caution people from going there, really. I think it's a very dangerous place to be. The only thing I want to say, just from a sort of practice point of view, which is, I do think it's really important that all these special units, you can't have too many of them. You just can't, really. My type of stuff is fit for a particular type of purpose for a particular time. Closing down the Rough Sleepers unit was harder than setting it up, because nobody wanted it to close. They were really nervous that we had this unit that was seen to be successful, and why would you stop it? Well, actually, sometimes you do need to stop these things. They have a life, they do a job, and then things need to be mainstreamed. And an anecdote to back this one up is on the antisocial behaviour job, I knew our time was done when actually ASBO was in the Oxford Dictionary and it was on EastEnders. There was this utterly brilliant moment on EastEnders where I think it was Kath, goes around, bangs on the door and says, "Your kid should be on an ASBO." I thought, I'm done. Here we are. I'm out of here. Phoned the Director of Communications in the Home Office and went, "I can't believe it. We're done. We're out. I'm done. Over. History." We've made tackling antisocial behaviour something that can be done. That's what that little vignette told me. And prior to that strategy, people in housing estates across this country put up with it and didn't think anything could be done about it. So no matter what you feel in liberal England about the ASBO, those people thought something could be done, and that's the right thing for me about what we were trying to do. And I think that it's a kind of really important thing that when I didn't at the beginning of rough sleeping, I'll be honest with you, I hadn't thought about the end, I hadn't thought about anything. I just thought about, you know, I was obsessed with rough sleeping and out on the streets and annoying everybody every time. Now, on the back of that experience for all the other jobs, we do think about how we mainstream almost before we start. So we actually have a plan on troubled families, for example, which means you won't just have a constant unit run doing something that actually needs to mainstream. And I think that's important. So you've got to know when to call it a day, and I call it a day now.
You haven't just resigned.
I didn't even write that, but wasn't that great segue into somebody else? And I can't take the credit for that segue. No, oh come on.
That's a great.
It's a light-hearted.
That's a great segue. That's great. You haven't just resigned.
No,
just to be clear.
No, God, I've
You've
got a mortgage to pay.
Just stop talking. So that's okay. Yeah.
I've once stopped talking.
Whatever.
It's rare.
Anyway, now David Halpern. David, when he was our research director, oversaw and co-authored a piece of work called Mindspace, which was commissioned by the Labour government about how you might apply behavioural insights into policy. And then, much as we tried to hang on to him, got the call and the lure of number 10 to go and apply that to government policy. So David, 5 years on, I think it's surviving and thriving. So David Halpern, how do you
Sure, so I'll make some comments also a bit about the history. So as it happens, I actually first came into government, to be a part of the Forward Strategy Unit, which is when Tony Blair wanted to create a special unit in the run-up to the 2001 election. And actually I've done a sequence of things with Louise on respect, when we kind of rebooted the social exclusion unit when the PM, then Blair, got interested in it, the social exclusion task force and so on. By the way, one of the things that was very striking, I remember at that time, was trying to find the space for, we're going to bring in 25 people to Cabinet Office, whatever, and wandering around Cabinet Office just to try and find the room. And it was very interesting because you literally open the door in some place and say, so who are you guys? And then it would be often you'd find units that you thought had been shut 5 years ago. It's like, didn't you guys? I go, no. It's actually never. We weren't ever shot down. And so it was quite an interesting lesson. And one of the ones we took forward when we were setting up the social exclusion, BIT, was to set it up with a sunset clause, which is the presumption it would be shut in 2 years unless it had met its objectives. And the PM would personally have to make that decision in order to keep that drive and pressure and avoid this issue of ending up a dried up twig on the family tree of government, as many units actually do. It's worth bearing in mind actually the counterfactuals in general. There are a lot of central units which didn't work, and tempted to list them, but you maybe come back to later. That, why didn't they work, and what happened in those particular situations? Often, see, PMs have got a great deal of freedom in certain kinds of ways. They don't have power in lots of other ways, of course. They don't have big budgets. They don't have big staffs directly. And so some of that is then, that same dynamic is cast onto any central unit if it's got a link to the PM, right? It's this sort of slightly Wizard of Oz aspect. In fact, remember when Social Exclusion Task Force, which is tail end of After Respect and the end of the Blair years, really, and trying to get even tiny amounts of resource out from, departments. In fact, I can remember, with the PM, you probably at the same meeting, and various of the cabinet sat around and he's saying, so we need some resources to do the following, not least on troubled families. And then literally everybody, all the ministers, in fact I remember David Miliband particularly, who had quite a big budget at CLG at the time, literally looking at the floor as the PM said, so who's going to put some resource in? It's worth, for the PMs, but also anybody who takes up that role, is that, she obviously talked to Louise, but, to try and get those commitments about resources early on and be clear about what the access is. And sometimes units are created because that was the solution, to be seen to do something. Exactly. So you create this thing, and then that's it. Right, okay, so literally, you didn't actually want to see the PM again, did you? That was, we did the press announcement. We're finished, aren't we? What are some of the lessons about what did work and what we actually, with BIT, I mean, it's gone through a slightly unusual journey, actually. I think it's an interesting contrast in that I partly went back to government in 2010 as much to do the big society work, which actually in some ways had more resources and more people. Anyway, it had its own story. Whereas BIT, I think, was the joker in the pack, where most people thought, you know, really? In fact, it was picked up in the media. Cameron's vanity project, etc. And it was a tiny operation. It was only 8 people. So the odds were rather stacked against this, I think. We did have very strong support from the Cabinet Secretary, as well as, well, from the PM, certainly from Steve, anyway, Steve Hilton and Rowe. You know, one of the things in the journey since then, which, we now in our new guise, we turned it into a social purpose company about 6 months ago, and we actually help other governments as well. So it gives an interesting new perspective, because quite often governments say, we really like what you do, can we do the same thing in country X? And it makes you realise a lot of the sort of details around the setup of the unit and the organisation itself are actually key to whether it's not enough just to have that's a nice idea, it doesn't mean it'll happen. So we often use mnemonics to help remind people of what works, so I'm going to give you one in a second. But the one that sits above it is clearly clarity of purpose, right? So first of all, like, is it clear what you're doing? Do you have a clear task responsibility? Louise has always been really clear about that, and I think that goes to an effective operation and an effective individual, because you're authentic yourself and that you've really got a sense of what you're on about, and that gives you distinctiveness, as opposed to you want to give a view on everything, not just in the public domain, but in terms of the traffic and the papers are going to the PM, you're trying to comment on every document, or why have you got any better opinion than anyone else in the machinery of government. So beyond kind of clarity of purpose, we sometimes use this phrase, kind of rudimentary, apples is the mnemonic if you want it. So apples, as in a piece of fruit. I'm not saying it's a brilliant mnemonic, but it's just what the letters seem to fit. So on the one hand, you need administrative and political support, and you need both those things, and one or the other puts you in a pretty dangerous place. So you kind of self-evidently need, I think, political support if it's a PM thing, and that's his primary thing. It's not resources per se. It's that if it's a PM or if indeed if it's even in a department, do you have that real political line of sight? And number 10, as many of you will know, looking around the room, is more a court than an ordinary organisation, in the sense that it's about who can authoritatively say this is what the PM thinks, right? And if Louise has talked to PM, she can say that. It doesn't matter some junior advisors. Actually, Louise can authoritatively say on this issue, look, I've talked to PM. This is what the PM thinks, right? It doesn't matter what your grade is. That gives you power and authority. So, you know, do you have political support, including that kind of authentic direct link? But also, do you have administrative support? That was incredibly important, certainly for the Behavioural Insights team, that we had a cabinet secretary, at that time, Gus O'Donnell, who was very, very passionate about the agenda. And he personally chaired then our steering board, and it gave us that sort of leverage and presence in the system. Because what we didn't do, we should have probably done more of, was really nail down more resources. Really tough an austerity government, but I mean, I know, you should have actually. Well,
Listen to Louise first, yeah.
You know, what is the budget? Really? Yeah, despite that. So administrative political support. On the other end of it, the other end of apples is, I mean, for us has been, what I'm kind of using a shorthand of is scholarship, actually just knowledge. You need to know something genuinely. Again, Louise was able to do that. She actually knows what she's talking about. Of course, Whitehall is full of very, very brilliant people who are in the job for about 10 minutes and move on, as we all know. And it actually matters that you really are authoritative in some sense about the knowledge. And for the Behavioural Insight team, I think we were able to do that. We really did. We spent a long time looking at the literature. We knew what we were talking about. We work a lot and continue to do so with the academic community across the world. And people do kind of detect that, ministers and others, that if you can combine that, you're passionate and you're clear about what you're trying to do, and you have some sense about what you're talking about, it's a pretty good start. I mean, for us, a big one, which would not be true for all, but is experimentation, which is an unusual one. I think you can rule it larger than that. So, but even if you're not formally doing it, you quite often won't know exactly what is the right thing to do, first of all. And you need the wriggle room to be able to experiment and try some things out, and some things won't work. I mean, for us, this has become a major part of our method, and we've pushed now also through the whole What Works movement and institutions, which is for deliberate experimentation in lots of areas of policy, to be able to say to governments and ministers, or indeed more generally to the public, actually we don't know the answer sometimes, but that's the bad news. The good news is we've got a method to try and figure out what the answer might be, or what would be effective. So I think I think that's more deeply important is that if you're to be more than something which has something to say in a moment of time, but has a lasting message, it has to evolve, it has to mature. You have to keep learning new things and getting better and better. Otherwise, the alternative, which is a lot to be said for it, is you shut down. You go mainstream because you think you've figured out what the solution is. The bit in the middle then of apples is people. So who are the right people? And that's kind of might be obvious, but again, from Louise's comments, you get a sense. I think you need a certain kind of mixed team. Some bits of government, not just central units, bring in a stream of quite senior outside people who definitely have the sense of my moment has come and I'm going to be there, and the minister or even the prime minister is going to keep asking me their view on everything. It's going to be fantastic. I live my life for this moment. And they've got a little, office somewhere, and then the machinery will warmly embrace them, and they'll never really leave the office again. And somebody's smiling, you recognise this, there's departments, there are a lot of people like this who are going around their corridors like, why doesn't someone listen to me? I can't get anything done, because they've been embraced in it. So I think it's about a certain kind of team as well as the individual who's got hopefully some real expertise or something special they're bringing in, but they actually do need around them people who know the system well, right? There's this great bit of work actually in the documented book Connected about what makes for a successful musical, which is a very particular combination of people. It's normally, you want some people you've worked with before, but actually you deliberately want to introduce into the mix some people who you haven't. You don't want an entirely fresh team and so on. So people who've got that knowledge, but also a real knowledge of the system and how it works, in terms of the Whitehall mechanics, but of course beyond that actually how the world works a bit as well, to work out what the pressure points are. So the right team and people. Again, I didn't do aggressively enough what you've done, which I think if I reflect on it, was just to really insist on some of my own people. And sometimes I've been given people and you think they were not the right person for it, but the system was being helpful sometimes, in inverted commas. Yeah. The last one I would put in, which again, if I think about across the world when we help other governments these days, is location, which might seem kind of obvious here, but it matters terribly where you are, literally physically in the system. And we sometimes see other governments who try and do something a bit like us. They say, this is great, we've got the same, we're setting them up there 2 miles over there in a university or whatever, and you just think, well, good luck with that. I mean, it's just so much of how, looking around the room, you'll know, the real business of government is done in the lobby of number 10, and indeed often in the lobby of Parliament, when you bump into people or walking up and down Whitehall, and you say, actually, nice to see you, can I ask you could we do the following? And to be physically in the midst of it is important for an effective central unit. So that's basically...
Another P, or have you misspelled apples?
No, because you got administrative support, political
support,
people,
that's
location.
Right, okay.
For me, experimentation,
no, okay. I was going to put in
and
passion,
scholarship.
But anyway, but no, that's
fine. No, maybe it would be better. Anyway, it's just partly, this is in relation to behavioural insight teams being created elsewhere. But you're right, I guess I'm saying above that is clarity of purpose and passion. And if you haven't got scholarship, at least get a pile of money. Would be a pretty good start. So I'll stop there.
Okay, that's very helpful. I think we're going to reissue the special ones as the apples of government or whatever, because that was very good. Makes me realise that we should have had a mnemonic in it, even if I can't pronounce it. John's sort of, in the sort of, John's going to talk at the lectern. Well done, John. I don't feel obliged. That wasn't a nudge that someone should talk at the lectern, just an opportunity. The social exclusion unit, I think, is really interesting and sort of slightly underknown now by people currently in government. People talk about open policy making. I think actually the social exclusion unit really pioneered real open policy making and did some actually sort of in its sort of first phase, and then maybe its reinvented phase, the social exclusion task force did some really, really interesting things in trying to answer some of those questions about how can government answer some of the problems that have been put in what Charles Clarke would call the very much too difficult box, but also do it in a sort of very different, much more joined up way. So, John, as a veteran of the social exclusion unit, please take to the lectern.
Thank you, Jill. I guess the social exclusion unit is probably the oldest of all the units, and I suspect the majority of people here probably don't even remember it. So we're going back to 1997, 1998 here, just for those of you who like to take a historical perspective on all of this. I just want to say a little bit about the SEU and set out what I think were the key things that enabled it to succeed, how its biggest project, neighbourhood renewal, was taken forward, and then 3 key lessons that I would like to emphasise as a result of all of that. Now, the SEU was set up to address what was seen as a major shortcoming in government. Because up to then, individual problems such as worklessness, low skills, high crime, poor housing, poor health had always been dealt with, by and large, by departments individually. And little attempt had been made to understand the complex links between them, or why they cluster in particular places, or how to prevent them happening in the first place. So the SEU's role was to improve government's ability to tackle these problems. And it's probably fair to say it had a fair amount of success, particularly in the first Blair term. And this was due to many of the points that David and Louise have mentioned that are in the IFG report. I mean, social exclusion was something that aligned very well with what was then termed the New Labour project. We had the firm support of the Prime Minister and pretty good access to him. We had a leader, Moira Wallace, with a Treasury and Number 10 background and was very good at influencing and finding a way around Whitehall, which I think is just so important. And then a team, which was a mix of civil servants and outsiders. I was an outsider. And that took a bit of time to get it right. Martin Wheatley was a colleague at this time. It took a bit of time to get that team right. The first go wasn't it. And it, as everyone said, it is so important to get it right. And I think one of the best books on management by Jim Collins, called From Good to Great, says one of the key things about a successful organisation is getting the right people on the bus. And it's kind of obvious, but you need to do it. So that's really, really important. And that mix of insiders and outsiders, the people with deep passion like Louise and people with that slightly more austere, dispassionate nature of the sort of traditional civil servant, makes for a very, sometimes healthy, creative tension through which good things will happen, hopefully. The other thing that I think we did reasonably well was maintain good relations with departments and agree the topics that we were going to choose with them, which were invariably topics which were priorities for them, which they found difficult, mainly because they were often the solutions were to them were cross-departmental. There was a lot of evidence on, emphasis on evidence, analysis, improving outcomes and making that really good, so that if the, to get through the sort of the firewall of Treasury analysts who said, no, we can't do this because actually none of this stacks up, we had to get that right. By and large, we did, and it was something Moira was very committed to. We consulted and involved people from outside Whitehall. I think we used to bring in residents groups from disadvantaged states into the Cabinet Office. I don't think that had ever happened before. And the other thing I think the unit had was a can-do attitude. And that's kind of quite important. And Moira, where she here, would stress the importance of Treasury support, because without it, they can just block everything. She would also stress the importance of knowing when you can break the rules. Because I remember seeing her after 6 weeks in the civil service, I said, I think I know the rules now. She said, that's not the issue. The issue is knowing when you can break the rules. And I think that was true too. So those are some of the thoughts about what made it work. The unit underwent various transformations since its 1997 inauguration, from the Cabinet Office to DETR and then back to the Cabinet Office. And there's a lot of discussion about how long these units should be set up for and how long they should last and so on. And I think the general consensus is they should generally be short-term, because the goal is to mainstream the successful activity they do. About 30 reports were produced on all sorts of social exclusion topics: rough sleeping, reoffending, young adults with complex needs, teenage pregnancy, and so on. But the key thing is that the SEU's job as a central unit was to influence and change mainstream policy. And it did lead to a change in the way that social exclusion was understood across government and more widely. It did find new ways of involving wider society in central government policy formulation, and it did lead to some quite significant changes in policy, some of which had a lasting impact. Now, one of the most ambitious projects was neighbourhood renewal. And the vision behind neighbourhood renewal was that within 10 to 20 years, nobody would be disadvantaged by where they lived. The social exclusion unit, to make this real, brought officials, frontline practitioners, and residents of deprived neighbourhoods together in 18 policy action teams, probably too many now, we probably wouldn't go for that number, to work on solutions. And sometimes those would meet all over the country. And this was a really considerable, very considerable undertaking. And to stop these different policy action teams crashing into each other, we appointed an air traffic controller, that was Moira's term, to make sure that they did the right thing at the right time and didn't produce all their 18 reports, which would be far too indigestible for government to take forward. The results of all this activity were distilled into a national strategy and action plan. A new unit was set up, located in what is now DCLG, to take it forward. And that was the Neighbourhood Renewal Unit led by Joe Montgomery. Now, just reflecting on all of this, as one is required to do before to come here, it did strike me just what an extraordinary commitment to neighbourhood renewal was made by government at this time. And that is in part due to it being an important issue for New Labour, but also the work of the SEU and all the people who were supporting the unit. That's very important to say that. It wasn't just the unit. There were lots of people throughout government, in the Treasury, ministers and so on, who wanted to make it work. And this is their success as much as the units. There was also a great deal, it was a whole of government exercise involving multiple departments and delivery vehicles and so on. And there was a lot of really interesting, innovative thinking that went into the strategy and action plan. I'll just very quickly mention some of these things. First of all, we created a set of minimum standards that no neighbourhood should fall below for health, education, jobs, housing and crime. These were called floor targets and were described by some as the social equivalent of the minimum wage. And some were also convergence targets aimed at narrowing the gap between the poorest local authority areas and the national average. And I don't think anything like this had been tried before. There was significant new funding. The new unit was set up, which had two directorates, one looking externally, one looking internally to Whitehall. And then we set up local strategic partnerships to make it all happen locally. But the key theme behind it is that neighbourhood renewal objectives on crime, housing, health and so on were not going to be achieved by special regeneration pots of money, but more by bending main government programmes, by mainstreaming this activity, so that government programmes would do better in the areas where hitherto they had performed least well. Now, two of the neighbourhood renewal funding streams lasted their full 10-year period. The unit lasted 6 or 7 years before it was closed, which isn't bad. And a review of the whole strategy, there were many component evaluations of neighbourhood renewal, but a review of the whole strategy published by the LSE in 2013 concluded that many places got better. Physical environments improved, 90% of social housing was brought to a decent standard, crime, litter and vandalism fell, and differences between the worst areas and the average narrowed. A second finding was that the gaps narrowed between poorer and richer areas on some measures such as school attainment, worklessness and death rates from cancer and heart disease. But some gaps did not close, and including life expectancy, and many remained large. And the third key finding was that investment in neighbourhood renewal was good value for money in terms of its impact on worklessness and so on, and cost-benefit analyses found that it was worth 5 times, the benefits were worth 5 times the amount invested. And the LSE review concluded that neighbourhood renewal policies achieved a great deal, including starting to reverse a trend of increasing inequalities between areas. But there was obviously some way to go before the central vision of neighbourhood renewal, that no one should be disadvantaged by where they live, could be realised. Realistically, achieving transformational change of this scale required policy continuity over a fairly considerable time. And when I think about it myself, I do wonder, I don't know what Martin feels about this, but I do wonder whether we could have achieved more given the level of support and resource we had. But that's a very personal view. So what are the implications of SEU neighbourhood renewal activity for government? And I'm thinking very much in terms of what all of this achieved in the real world, not just the operation of the units within government. And I think the IFG report captures many of the lessons learned. There are three I'd particularly like to emphasise. The first is leadership. Very difficult to secure agreement between departments on joint action over time, and hard to maintain a corporate vision when there's so much else going on. Continuity of leadership's invariably interrupted by changes of ministers and officials and so on. We all know about that. So I think under the circumstances we didn't do too badly. But topics like neighbourhood renewal need leadership over a longer period. They need political leadership, political leaders who've got the vision and the stature to drive progress across government, senior officials who provide leadership in departments on designing and implementing better policies, and champions in central government. I use that word advisedly, champions, not just champions in central government, local government, and in communities, with the personal commitment, the clout to push through barriers, and a willingness to stay long enough to make an impact. And I actually think that we underestimate the importance of champions in taking forward some of this work. And I think central units, when faced with challenges of this kind, may want to think more about that dimension to leadership. The second lesson is around delivery capability, making stuff happen out there. I think it's really important that central units should draw on the experience of those operating at the front line and those who may be the people, the groups of people that the units have been set up to try to help. They should promote the policy interventions likely to make the biggest impact. That sounds obvious, but often it doesn't happen. And take account of evidence of what works. And critically, which I don't think we've sorted out at all, is how to scale up successful interventions. And I think we need more people who understand these implementation issues in Whitehall and locally, so we can make better progress at tackling long-term difficult issues. And when I was in the SEU and the NRU, this point preoccupied me a lot, and I did feel often that many places were investing money in activity that was unlikely to make a difference. And my third and final lesson is about continuity over the longer term. Not continuity of the unit, but continuity of effort to make progress on the issues. Given the short-term focus of much of UK government, I think the NRU did well to maintain the strategy for as long as it did. But as I've said, policies like neighbourhood renewal need continuity over successive parliaments. And I think central units need to think more about the longer term, about how cross-party commitment might be secured and how progress might be maintained. Too often, there's a lack of interest in what went before, not much on what might come after, and precious little collective memory. The new What Works centres, which David is an advisor to, I think are a brilliant way of addressing this problem, although it's probably too soon to say that they have sorted that problem out. And I do really think we need to find ways of encouraging cross-party coalitions on those priority topics where there's already a good deal of common ground. Prevention, early intervention, those sorts of issues I think would be a good start. And select committees I think offer a model to build on. So in summary, I think the SEU and the NRU showed what can be achieved when there is leadership, drive and purpose. The SEU took a fresh approach to analysing a complex problem, set out how it might be tackled and secured a lot of support. The NRU coordinated action across Whitehall and externally. I think there's a huge amount to learn from these initiatives, even though most people have forgotten about them. And therefore I'd like to congratulate Jill and the IFG for realising that. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, well, I think that was a really interesting set of 3 contributions. Hopefully that stimulated some thoughts and reflections. So what I'm going to do is do it. It's quite interesting, David's point on space. In our report, we note that the Australian Cabinet Office specifically has quite good space. I've got one or two people here from the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet in Australia. Specifically has space so that if Prime Ministers want to set up things, there's some space so the person doesn't find themselves in the basement without a photocopier or printer, etc., etc. So I'm going to take questions in clutches. As I said, comments also allowed. Yes. There's a microphone roving around.
Camilla Hagelund from Reform. I wanted to ask Louise about this point about how you are thinking the mainstreaming for how to keep the programs going after the job is done. Because often, as you've talked about, the problem is the siloed way government works. So how do you keep departments working on the issues? Thank you.
Okay, we'll take a couple more, see if we can bunch them. Yes, here.
Thanks. Ollie Hilbury from the Making Every Dark Matter Coalition. So we work across the country helping local areas to create better outcomes for people facing issues of homelessness, substance misuse, mental health and offending. So we'd love the next administration to create a national focus on individuals facing multiple needs. And so I wondered what the panel's thoughts are on how topics are selected for special units.
How topics are selected, okay? Yes. And David, yeah, tell us who you are.
David Walker, Guardian Public. If I can rephrase in rougher way a question which John's just raised. Are special units any more likely to survive the vagaries of political, ideological change? And you'll forgive me, Louise, if I remind you of what a senior Conservative minister said about social exclusion, respect and antisocial behaviour on assuming office in 2010. As with so much of what they, i.e. Labour, did, their top-down, bureaucratic, gimmick-laden approach just got in the way of the police, of the professionals and the people.
Okay, that's a helpful salutary reminder there from David. I think let's first of all go to this question of mainstream, which John touched on. I'm the transfer into DETR, ODPM, CLG, multiply renamed department was obviously an attempt to mainstream. I mean, how are you thinking, Louise, on troubled families? You said you were already thinking about, the sort of exit strategy. I mean, how do you think you would aim to mainstream that when you're no longer doing that one, doing the next thing?
I'm still there for a while, Jill. There's a connection, I think, though, between what, David, you've just asked and this issue of mainstreaming. So in terms of our own work on this one, I think it's clear, isn't it, that essentially high-cost individuals or families, and there's an argument that you could do both, actually also they have problems that would be quite nice to help them not have, or certainly adjust their lives so that they can live with less disadvantage and less issues that stop them getting on with bringing their kids up and going out to work like everybody else. So there's lots of very compelling reasons, I think, why you would run a programme, call it Troubled Families, call it Family Intervention, call it Respect. I mean, we're doing it to size under this administration on a very significant level, but the starting point of the Troubled Families programme lies in a project in Dundee in Scotland, set up by then NCH, years and years ago. And again, you were reminding us all how old we were and how nobody in the audience remembered the social exclusion unit. Cheers, I was feeling quite cheerful before I came in here. And, I think there is something about trying to get that collective memory and work out what's the best way of making something work. And I would say we had a go under Respect. We set up what I would now describe as boutique projects all around the country. They were lovely. Blair said, fine, off you go. We set up 50 family intervention projects. We did it in lightning speed. They are fabulous individual projects, but they're pop-up projects that open and close. Lesson learned, this time round we had to look at a much bigger system in terms of how it worked with families, why families, whether you like them or love them, love them or hate them, I happen to love them, they've got upwards of 14 different organisations prodding them in their lives, and yet their kids still aren't in school and they're not in work. So, we knew we were onto something, and I think mainstreaming is when actually it's not us being onto something, it's everybody out there wanting something to be solved, and you're the right people at the right point to come behind them and help shape it. That's the only reason why the Troubled Families programme is successful, and it's as successful in Labour strongholds as it is in Conservative areas, because there's an overall sense that this is the right thing to do. It's of its moment because it's a programme of the head and the heart. It's a programme of the head because we have to save money and that money has to be real, and it's a programme of the heart because it's the right way of doing it. And I think myself that part of what people in positions, senior positions in government on the civil service side have to do is sometimes negotiate that difficult position. And this isn't my line, I think it belongs to the chap that runs community, the great bloke who runs London in the East End, that basically, I remember him saying it at something with Anne Power at the LSE, which is he's tired of the left and the right, and basically you get caught in doing what's left or what's right rather than what's right and what's wrong. And I think that, you know, I absolutely loved that when he said that. And I thought, God, I wish I'd thought of that myself, because that's a great quote. And that's exactly what I think then what we have to do is persuade ministers and persuade opposition people that this is the right way of going about doing it, and that will make a thing that is good survive. Now, it doesn't always work, David. You are absolutely right. I've been, you know, we've known each other a long time, and I've run these things. Sometimes they've survived, sometimes they haven't survived. I think this time round, I'm wise to that, and I've been working incredibly hard, as is all the team, all the local authorities across the country are doing this programme. We aren't doing projects, we aren't doing pilots, we're not doing pop-up, and we're not doing experimentation. We're getting on with it, because actually we all know how this needs to be done. We just need to liberate some people to do it properly. So for me, that will make the mainstream easier, really. And I think there is this gimmick thing, you know, let's be honest about it. There is a sense that people want headlines, and they want what I call pop-up announcement and pop-up projects. You have to be really careful to make sure that those things fit within a wider strategy of getting something going. So today, I hope to God, the Department of Health and our own department are announcing something on what's called data sharing. They're not at all. Okay, today or at some time, sorry Dan, at some time in the near future, David, please don't blog or do that. But I'm hoping at some point, please David, please don't do that to me.
Louise, you are on camera, so anyway.
Anyway, at some point we may do an announcement that I now can't talk about. I can't remember the reds, but I just stopped that because I've now gone bright red as well. So I'll just move on, Jill.
You're among friends here.
No, I'm not never among friends. The other thing, sorry, note to everybody, which is doing all of these things is not about being popular. It's so much easier to say, I'll tell you what, it's all too tough. Let's be nice to criminals because they can all be rehabilitated easily. I tell you what, Blair, you know, old David Blunkett, don't worry, let's just set up a load of youth clubs and you'll solve antisocial behaviour overnight. In the current job, let's just hand out more money to these families so they can spend it, frankly, some of them on things they shouldn't be spending it on, and they're spending it on it because they're miserable, and I don't judge them for that, but that money isn't getting to their children. So, you know, those are the difficult things, and I think that the difference between writing a report that, you know, it's whether the reports walk out of Whitehall and make a significant change in a community is about whether the community wants that change, whether it's ready for it, and whether we do it respectfully. So I do worry about this kind of top-down special units. You know, we do nothing clever in the stuff that we do. We try and get people to do what they want to do, and we try and liberate them to do it.
Okay, David, mainstreaming, which I think, I will come on to topic selection, which I think is quite interesting. Topic as well, but mainstream. So you're a different unit. In our report, we distinguish between two sorts of unit. We have topic units who are there to tackle an issue, or issue units we could call them, and what we call methodology units who work across a whole range of issues but are actually promoting a sort of changed approach, which I think the Behavioural Insights team certainly does. And actually one of your sort of remits were both proof of concept, but I also think some capability building as well. I mean, is the vision at the end that every civil servant can apply behavioural insights and therefore you wither away? It's
well,
not
indeed,
good for your business model, or
one of the three objectives of the Behavioural Insight team was to spread understanding of the approaches and see adoption in at least two major policy areas. But I agree with you. I mean, basically, you normally see these two distinctions. Either it's a very specific task or objective, or it's actually slightly more it's about a different approach. It does go just to very quickly deal with this issue of why do things get selected. I mean, normally it's because there's a match between something that the PM or a senior figure wants to do and what the system is failing to do. I mean, that is the gap, right? So that can either be, you know, we're not getting a grip on this issue, so troubled families, or ones where there are multiple departments involved, no one's getting a grip on it either at national or local level, so what the hell are we going to do about it? So you create a team. But sometimes it's always, often, particularly on a change of administration, is that there's a belief there's a different kind of approach. And that actually also is the corollary of that, which drives the demise of many units across the world, is that they don't realise, and it's true for much of the civil service and institutions, you don't realise you've adopted a certain kind of way of working or thinking about the world, which actually, to some people, looks political, right? And so the PMSU, the demise of the PMSU, which sort of struggled on for a little while, so strategy unit, it didn't really make that tweak. It didn't intuitively, on some level, the leadership, get what the new administration was about. Not least that the new administration itself didn't really believe in high strategy. It's a rather important fundamental problem for a strategy unit. So those things sort of fit together. On the demise following through, I mean, it's an interesting contrast. So obviously we saw the PMSU demise, we saw other things. Even it was felt, of course, why Tony got interested in rebooting the social exclusion unit into the task force was that it had kind of drifted too far from the centre and some of his concerns and so on, as well as it might have been losing leverage, sat where it was. On the other hand, I do think troubled families is incredibly interesting. So, I mean, when I was thinking literally of when Blair was trying to get resources and we couldn't do it, we got like 15 million we managed to squeeze out from departments. It was tail end, it was tiny amounts when we were doing the 2006 social exclusion work, particularly we do more on troubled families. As it happens, there was real interest, particularly from Steve Hilton. It might be that some of the trappings above went, but it's a 450 million odd program. It was much more ambitious than that, which on trouble. Yeah, absolutely. So in that sense, it had become mainstreamed, which is pretty impressive, I think. But the last thing, almost maybe implicit for a lot of these things, there's a question not just the demise at a change of administrations, but those demise can happen quite often, or you just have no impact at all. And I think a common story for those units and people who have had impact and have survived more than a little while is that they've been canny about identifying early wins. It's just key, right? You have to be able to solve, we all know this, right? You have to be able to solve your minister's or your prime minister's problem or start to be a solution as opposed to you're just bringing prime minister's even worse than you thought. It's like, oh my God, thanks, join the pile. So, I mean, for us and Behavioural Insight team, it was really important that we identified some early things which we thought would actually work, had some political resonance. For us, particularly because people can be very sceptical, that we systematically did test it. And a pivotal moment was 8 months in, being able to go to PermSec's Wednesday morning meeting and say, here's the first 4 results. Look at what it is. So even if PermSec's pretty sceptical, which they tend to be, rightly, they can immediately see actually it costs almost nothing and we can get results. We can get something useful out of that. And then you're really on the road in the same way, if you can sort out rough sleepers. I mean, actually, for the 97 administration and the scale of the majority it had, it was a very modest early agenda. But getting the early results gave people confidence to do more ambitious things too.
John, do you have any views on topic selection?
No, not really. I mean,
that's allowed.
I kind of think they select themselves in a way. There's always many more topics on a long list than you can ever possibly do, and it's making sure that you select ones which are which are obviously a priority for the relevant departments and for the ministers and so on at the time, and which, if successful, will deliver some real impact. I think with the social exclusion unit, with all the many projects we could have selected, actually we probably did get through most topics over that long period, but it was usually to do with trading between the SEU and the departments and the Treasury and the group of ministers that used to oversee all of this activity and come up with a good set of policy areas. And
did you want ministerial buy-in before you selected a topic from the department to know you had a landing place?
I mean, but Martin, because I was so involved in neighbourhood renewal, I didn't have a lot to do with the other topics, but I think generally it did tend to work best when the departments were on side, but there may have been very good reasons for choosing a topic which the department didn't want you to do, and that would have led to a different sort of set of dynamics, but it needed to be challenged.
Yeah. We'll go back for some more questions. I'm going to add one point though. I used to oversee part of the thing called the Sustainable Development Unit in DEFRA. Every green group known to mankind wanted it in the Cabinet Office. They said, the government's not serious about sustainable development, this unit should be in the Cabinet Office. And I used to say, actually, if the Prime Minister was passionate about this, then you're right. But if the Prime Minister's not that interested, then the worst of all worlds is to be a vanity unit in the Cabinet Office for the sake of being in the Cabinet Office without that support. You're better off being in a department which actually will give you some budget, will give you some support and champion it or whatever, because orphan or zombie units are worse than death. Anyway, that's a bit of advice there. Anyway, let's go to some more questions. Yes, back there, and then we'll come here. Thanks. Yes, tell us who you are.
Simon Judge, Department for Education. My question is, what advice would you give to the head of a new unit about talking to the heads of all the other units, or at least understanding roughly what they're up to? The reason I say that is that often from a departmental perspective, there's an awful lot of this stuff coming at us, and we have to try and manage and synthesize it, and it can often look a bit uncoordinated. Do you think that matters from your perspective as a head of a central unit, or should you just get on and keep your focus on your particular issue?
Do you think there's a particular problem of coordination between multiple units as opposed to between a unit and people, you know, doing their day job and stuff like that? Okay, interesting. Yes. Here.
Daniel Thornton, formerly of Whitehall, currently in exile. Louise and John, you both spoke about bringing in, I mean, you all spoke about bringing in outsiders, but I think you were both, John and Louise, focusing on bringing people in who were kind of users of the services or practitioners and much closer to the sort of front line, as it were. Can you expand on how that worked and how the insights of those people got translated into administrative action and budget and regulations and laws and so on? Because when I was in Number 10, I used to see these delivery discussions that the Prime Minister had, and I was never quite sure what happened as a result and how those insights were translated.
Okay, very good question. Yes, and here.
Hi there, my name's Jim Minton. I work for an organisation called London Youth. Jill, you began to answer the question actually before, but I'll ask it anyway. About where it's best to sit. We've got a kind of arm's length place there. I know, Louise, you've been in various departments, but in the middle, and obviously, John, from your experience, you've been in a different place. Partly asking because the thing called youth policy these days sits in Cabinet Office, and it's a very good team running it now, but there's kind of arcane debates in our sector about whether it should sit in DFE or wherever. So it's kind of, I know it isn't a unit, but it's kind of an interesting thing to ask. So.
Okay, that's all very helpful. Slightly got the impression from Simon that the question with actually did having lots of units actually increase coordination problems rather than sort of sometimes they're seen as a solution to coordination problems to have things brought together under one unit. But I don't know whether any of you got any perspectives on Simon's, you know, talking to other units. You know, is there a cross-unit discussion, alignment process?
Yes, I definitely have views. I mean, basically, you've got to get on with your own job and get on with it. And I think what you were saying is actually about, you know, you land and you're asked to do something or you want to do something. Let's put it that way round. I've had it that way round. You've got to make sure, there is a thing though in Whitehall, let's be honest about it, that somebody will say, well, this is an issue, Prime Minister or Minister or Parliamentary Under Secretary of State or whoever, and everybody will rock up and say, we're on it. So homelessness, we're on it. We're building some housing. Somebody else will say, we've got a leaving care package. Somebody else will say, we're building prisons. Somebody else will say, we've done a leaflet. And, you know, seriously, we've all sat in those meetings, you know, yes, Minister, we're on it. The lines to take at the meeting that you're going to say that you're on it are these. And they're briefed to turn up at a meeting and go, we're on it, Minister, because we're doing this, that and the other. Yeah, and that happens. Some of that's okay, but actually, if you want to get something actual done, either as a minister or something else, then actually just lines on all the activity that could possibly be attached to the world of troubled families. You might as well spend a year letting people telling you all of them, anything that begins with F and ends with Y, will tell you about in Whitehall, and you'll be there till, you know, you're in wherever you're exiled to. And you won't get much done. And there's a fine balance, obviously, between that and making sure that people are part of what it is you're trying to do and that they shape it. So I think it's slightly more sophisticated in my view, which is colleagues across Whitehall have huge amounts of power. They need to feel part of and shape what you are doing on your strategy in order to not just turn up with a million lines to take about, you know, every kid has a future type world. So don't you worry, Louise, we're on troubled families, versus actually something really helpful and useful. When I started out, I was in something called Ashdown House, which was, you know, miles away from where the ministers were. I was placed next to Boulder Policy, next to the canteen, where people used to fall asleep in the canteen. And my office was next to there, back on Victoria Street when they owned that building. We were exiled. And you know, that suited me fine at the time because I thought that was fine. Now, of course, I'm not necessarily, you know, popping about in the lobby in Number 10 very much. But I do think where you are matters, and I think where you are strategically matters. I think seniority, unfortunately, matters hugely. What rank the person is running the unit matters. Let's be honest about it. You know, all of those things still matter a lot. I don't know that's good or bad, that's just how it is, and you've got to get on and deliver. So you could have endless discussions where people fell trees for Britain about all the good things that are going on and still do absolutely little.
So what about this point about bringing the sort of user perspective practitioner? I mean, this was sort of pioneered in a sense by SEU, I think, the first people who sort of went out and actually talked to, you know, pregnant teens rather than people who talked on behalf or at pregnant teens and stuff like that.
I do remember a group of, they weren't all pregnant, but I do remember a group of teenagers from some fairly rough place in the northeast coming into the Treasury, and a Treasury civil servant whose name I won't remember deliberately, talking to them in some wonderfully arcane language. I can't remember the phrase that was used, but it was in the sort of same order as endogenous growth theory. That wasn't a good dialogue. But what we tended to do was to make sure there's just a principle of involving the people you are wanting to support, improve their outcomes for in the process of designing the policy and implementing it. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is to get it right. You need to test it. You need to make sure it has that real world test to it. Otherwise it just won't happen. And I think what this exercise did and everything that followed was to provide opportunities for a lot of people to really exercise leadership in their communities. And I can remember now, some years later, I can remember vividly some of the mainly women actually who took a leadership role in their communities and were really quite remarkable, and I hope they went on to thrive after that. So I'm not saying that we started that, but we did catalyse some change in terms of making sure policy in Whitehall was better informed by the real world and how people felt about these things in the real world, and that people out there were given an opportunity to play a leadership role.
So Louise, in our report, I'm not sure whether we attributed it to you or not, so I'm feeling a bit nervous. So it might have been someone else other than Louise, but someone said that one of the things they looked for when they were building their team was that they needed people who other people wanted to be in the room with, to sort of that people could really sort of work with. I just wondered how that affected your ability to sort of work with practitioners and things like that, what you're looking for in that.
I think kind of, yes, that might have been me. I think interpersonal skills are just, in my type of arena anyway, so I'm not scoping out strategies and papers to try and affect things here. I'm trying to get something done. So it really matters the type of people that we have as part of our team and as part of our wider families, where I think, you know, charm and a little bit of menace is probably that would, in my overall approach to delivery, they would be my words. In terms of so just give you a real example, for the antisocial behaviour legislation that was the white paper and then the legislation, we used a network. Network's too grand a word for it. We had about 5 or 6 people, some of whom we seconded indirectly. They were merged into the white paper team and the bill team. So, and we did it because they wanted this legislation overnight. What do I know about a white paper and legislation? Nothing, I can assure you. So we got a bill team type people from the civil service to kind of know how to get a bill done, but we needed to do it really quickly and we needed to make sure it was utterly accurate. So every bit that went through Parliament could be enacted immediately in order to get something done in a city on the civil legislation side. So we combined 2 groups of people, which was quite interesting. In itself, and we used frontline people to help us. And they weren't frontline, they were sort of managers and lawyers from local authorities on the whole and large housing associations when we did that. In my current team, we have, again, you know, troubled families, we've come at it a slightly different way. But yeah, I think the thing is that people don't want to be done to. They want to feel part of something. It's like we all want to make sure that kids don't grow up not going to school. It's kind of, nobody will disagree with that as a statement. It's how you get there. So what you have to do is find people that, you know, people want to see when they step off a train. I want people to think, oh, great. Well, they don't think that about me, but hopefully they think about that about my team, which, oh, good, I'm glad, you know, Sue Strickland's coming, or Ian Brady. That's the trick in it all, yeah.
So Dave, this question of where you said location mattered, so you were talking about physical location, proximity, you can be part of a department, but actually in that very convenient and vacant Reading or Newcastle building and stuff like that. But I just wonder whether you had a view on, is it better to sit in the Cabinet Office, is it better to be part of the department? I mean, had this slightly strange move from DFE.
Your argument about the worst of all was to be in centrally without strong political backing. Right? You're better off in being in a department where the actual resources are. And a lot of people are seduced into the temptation of, we'll be in the Cabinet Office on number 10. And actually it's a disaster for them. I mean, I do think one of the things that you can think of some of these special units as being, they're like an institutional wormhole, right? And that they link to unexpected places in an unusually short loop, right? So that they create, I mean, of course you kind of embody that, but something direct to the front line, but bringing it into the centre of government. Now, actually, ministers themselves, because they're MPs, have a bit of that inside the system anyway. They turn up and they've got an authentic direct experience. So that's one of the things they do. In terms of numbers and how they work together, I mean, the whole point is if you have a pile of them, it doesn't work anymore. It's already the case that many senior civil servants will tell you they spend 80% of their time finding out what other civil servants in other departments are doing and or trying to stop them. So just creating a whole load more units doesn't help. And there have certainly been times, I think, OPSR, when it was around. Anybody remember that one? I mean, like...
Does anyone know what that stands for? If they do,
Office
they
of Public
can have a
Service
copy.
Reform, or whatever it was.
Thank you, David.
At the same time as we had Strategy Unit and various other things. I mean, there were definitely Permsecs who just gave a clear instruction: if you receive anything from them, just put it in the bin. I mean, a lot of departments will generally have that view of anything from the centre. But if it is authentically as a small number of things which really do represent some key priority for the PM or potentially a minister, by definition it has to be a small number. And if you start seeing these multiplying and they don't have a clear focus, then basically it's going to have no effect, right?
Yeah.
By the way, in terms of coordination, it's an interesting fact, it carries on now for government in general, but it is kind of slightly frightening sometimes just how much it seems to me the coordination of British government rests on Jeremy Hayward email over the weekend. Anyway, case for small government, I suppose.
Ah, well, there are 48 hours in the weekend, and Jeremy works all of them, so that's okay. I was going to ask one question. When we were writing this report, one of my colleagues here said we shouldn't really be sort of promoting these central units because actually aren't the fact that Prime Ministers feel the need that the only way they can get Whitehall to do what they want is to set up a new little special unit to bring in extra capability, to adopt a new methodology, to focus on an issue that matters to them, is actually a symptom that the whole system is actually underlyingly just not very good. I mean, they're a symptom of a system failure, if you like, and that actually the fact that they seriously have to go to Louise to sort out problems is a sign that actually the other 300,000 civil servants aren't getting onto the delivery case and stuff like that. I just wondered whether you felt that there always ought to be a place for these sort of little bits of grit to throw in, or actually there was something we ought to do more fundamentally to render them less necessary. David?
Remember, a lot of stuff doesn't turn up into a unit, right? So implementation unit today will be working on at least half a dozen issues, which it is chewing a way through to say, can we make more progress? Why isn't it happening on the ground? So generally the response will not be the creation of a unit. So I think it is rather important to see it in that broader context.
Okay.
I think people shouldn't see these things as separate to the civil service. I think that they're a response to people that go and get themselves elected and want to get things done. And one method is I often say about, be careful. So, politicians either bring in laws or they change tax, and that's the way they think you get something done. Behaviour change, which is a lot of what I've been involved with over the years, isn't going to be solved necessarily by either of those two things. You need a different approach. So you get different approaches. And I think that we shouldn't see these special units as overly special. They're just part of getting the business of government done in a particular way. I have a slightly higher public profile than some of the other people that do these units, and it's all horses for courses, isn't it? And I wish that we didn't so feel, we're failing because the Prime Minister set something up. Well, not necessarily, because actually, joking aside about the work that I say people say is happening in departments is good in itself. I mean, I think, Jim, sorry, just to answer your question on the youth thing, there is a role possibly in the centre for a coordination of what all government departments are doing to actually check whether they are actually making a rub and getting on with their job properly. If, on the other hand, a minister wanted to, set up a national network of youth clubs within seconds to do something overnight, they're better off being in DFE or a spending department where you get that done, or CLG in order. So I think there is a whole fit for purpose thing, Jill, and my kind of, I know this is probably the last thing that we'll say today, is I just don't want an us and them. I think that's a really bad place to be. I and the units I have been privileged to be responsible for only survive, only are effective, largely because of colleagues in the civil service. Not necessarily political patronage, not necessarily those sorts of things. They survive because we have become a mainstream approach to how you deal with difficult and sometimes problems that people want done quickly. And that's the civil service. It's us at our best. I am, and always have been, a civil servant for the last 16 years. I'm not anything other than a, externally recruited, went through all those bloody awful tests just like everybody else had to, probably failed them, but in those days you were given a chance, and here I am. Nowadays I wouldn't make it into any stream of any kind, but here I am and you're stuck with me. So I don't want an us and them. I think that's a really dangerous place to be.
And John, final word.
I think this is, in a sense, we're reframing the concept of the central unit as being something that's set up when bits of Whitehall aren't performing properly to try and make them to perform better, rather than taking issues that are genuinely really difficult and intransigent and cross-departmental and using central units and special units to catalyse change, which is then taken forward by the relevant departments. So I think that's a better way of seeing these things.
Okay, that's a very good point on which to end. So, thanks very, very much to our panel, to John, David and Louise. Thanks all very much for you two coming. If you want to read the report, it's up there. We may have to do another version to incorporate some of these additional things, and not least to incorporate David's fantastic apples thing, which I'm still thinking about. It's all very interesting. If you want to read the whole thing, as I said on the centre, read our report to Centre Forward, which talks about these as one of the sort of many capacities that the civil service should be offering a Prime Minister, a new Prime Minister, etc., as part of their core offer. That's going back to the apples again. Meanwhile, I think we'll have to write the special ones, the musical, building on David's view that that's what it's all about. Very well orchestrated. Thank you all very much for coming, and hope to see you at our next event.
Thank you, Jill.
And could I just mention, in case any of you are interested, that tomorrow we're publishing a paper on the National Security Council, which was a bit of governance reform that David Cameron did. So, anyway.